Well, howdy everybody. Sorry for the long hiatus. Hey, that reminds me of a joke. Horse walks into a bar. Bartender says, "Why the long hiatus?" Anyway, it's been since early November that I shared my musings and simple country wisdom with you. Of course, the holidays intervened. We were quite busy with friends and family, but I guess the biggest issue is that my wife took back her office, which is where I have my studio set up. It's a little bit selfish, but that's all right. So I've moved to my wargaming room and my movie room. Got a big old TV right there and some movie theater seats. Now we call this, I don't know if you can see or not how low the ceiling is, we call it the Hobbit room because you got a duck to get in here. Oh, no offense to any halflings that are among my subscribers, except for the Sackville Bagginses. I hate them, they can go to hell. But anyway, enough about me. As I'm sure you've heard, my sole 5 yeehaw candidate, Bernie Sanders, has been doing pretty well of late. But then, of course, he did pretty well last time round, too, and unfortunately, the 2016 Democratic Party decided it'd be a real laugh if we ended up with Donald Trump for 4 years. Ha ha! Some of that negative sentiment has been arising this time around, though so far without too much effect. Still, it's to be reckoned with, so I thought I'd address some of the related issues. Oh, by the way, that Chris Matthews fella has sure been vilified for comparing Sanders' win in Nevada to the fall of France to the Nazis in 1940, but give the guy a break. That's just the way he talks. I don't know if you remember, but back when Happy Days was canceled in 1984, he said that was a bigger tragedy than the Jonestown Massacre. And he opined that expanding the baseball playoff format was worse than the firebombing of Dresden. Most recently, I'm sure you heard him say that he saw significant parallels between the Houston Astros sign-stealing fiasco and the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. It's just hyperbole, folks. Get off his back before he starts comparing you to Hitler or Vlad the Impaler. Anyway, like I said, there's a number of Democrats that are terrified of Sanders' candidacy, and the criticisms come from a variety of directions. For example, Sanders is too old. Now, that's actually a very good point. Sanders is 78. Just like Michael Bloomberg, who is also 78, but very much unlike Joe Biden, who is 77. Sanders is too angry. Well, if you aren't angry, you don't know what the hell's going on. Income maldistribution, hijacking of our political system by corporate and foreign interests, resurgence of fascism and white supremacy, private sector debt burdens, climate change, international instability, monopolization of industry, and on and on. We are witnessing a terrifying transformation of normality. I want my candidate to be angry, very angry. Here's another one they say, well, Sanders said the same dang thing for years and years. Well, that's because nothing's changed. In fact, it's gotten worse. If you're standing on my foot continuously during a Johnny Cash concert, God rest his soul, I'm going to keep bringing it up over and over. Is that all you can talk about is me standing on your foot? Well, yeah, until you get off it. Sanders is too radical. Well, that's a relative term. If this were the Roman Empire and I suggested that I was thinking of giving my slaves weekends off, I'd be called the Latin equivalent of a bleeding heart liberal because of my horrifically radical ideas with respect to slaves' rights. On the other hand, today, my view of what my slaves should be doing Monday through Friday will probably be frowned on, probably, by supporters of both parties. But Sanders is about as radical as FDR. He's not calling for the social ownership of the means of production. He is not suggesting that economic systems undergo some sort of pseudo-Hegelian transformation until they reach communism. He's not arguing that there's a secularly declining rate of profit that contributes to increasing numbers of crises over time. By the way, if you didn't follow all that and you think Sanders is a communist, well then you understand about as much about Marx as Joe Biden does about personal space. Now, ironically, what Sanders really wants is something that's closer to what capitalism was supposed to be about. That is, a system that served the people, not the elites. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, argued that you couldn't throw an entrepreneur any further than you could trust him. No, I think he said the opposite. You can't trust an entrepreneur any further than you can throw him. Good thing I have a field in history of economic thought. And so we need lots of competition among firms to ensure that they are forced to work hard to satisfy the customer. Now, instead, what we've had is merger after merger and increasing corporate influence over state, local, and federal governments. Theoretically, capitalism is about the diffusion of power. In reality, it has facilitated a concentration of power. In a nutshell, this is what Sanders wants. Hardly very radical. The diffusion part, not the concentrating part. Sanders' policies would disrupt the existing economy. Well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? When something ain't working, you disrupt it. I think one of the most ridiculous arguments along these lines that I've heard is that universal health care would do all kinds of damage to the existing healthcare industry. Oh, good Lord, I hadn't thought about that. You mean that creating a system that meets the needs of all Americans in a civilized and dignified manner, thus allowing us to join the ranks of every developed nation on the planet, plus some developing ones, might require an adjustment process? That ending an era where we were able to boast the lowest life expectancy, the highest infant mortality, and the greatest per capita cost on the planet might not mean business as usual? That making 62% of all personal bankruptcies, that is, those associated with medical costs, go away might just affect profits, wages, employment, and firm viability within the current health industry. If only these helpful Democrats had been around in the 1860s, we could have helped those poor people who were negatively impacted by the Emancipation Proclamation. Here's another one. Sanders is a socialist. Now, though this fear is more common among non-Democrats, there is definitely a strain of this within the DNC and its supporters. First of all, I encourage you to watch my very first video, which explained what the word socialism really means. And I've already said a few words about this up above when I said something about radicalism. But let me add a couple of things here. First, yes, he absolutely supports some non-market initiatives not embraced by all of the other Democrats. One does not find in his policies the idea, the implicit assumption that the market system is the only way we can solve our problems. Indeed, it is because it will not address anything that isn't profitable, is that it won't solve all the problems. Unfortunately, that leaves a lot of things unaddressed, like national defense, caring for orphans, any services oriented towards the poor, education, police protection, fire protection, so on. Oh, and climate change. And quit going on about these public-private partnerships like you're doing something righteous and holy if you include business. Everything that's good does not have to make a profit for somebody. If it makes sense to include business, that's great. But if not, we do what we do without hesitation. When we are approaching defense spending, winning World War II was wholly a government project. There's a reason why Ford Motor Company did not open up a Sherman tank showroom to the general public. It wasn't going to make any money. So, yes, you're right. Under Sanders, there's not an assumption that the market can solve everything, nor is there an assumption that the private sector will create a job for every willing worker, hence the job guarantee. If you can't find a job, the government will hire you. Now note that these would be intentionally unprofitable but socially useful undertakings. Did I mention climate change? Of course, we already employ millions of people doing jobs just like that. The military, the police, national park rangers, and so on are all doing things that aren't profitable, but create a social service for the rest of us, create a social good. Now, the goal of the job guarantee would be to extend the idea that we already have with park rangers and so forth, give everybody a chance to develop skills and contribute to the welfare of our nation. Incidentally, under such a system, staying at home with your children could be a job. Why leave and go out to work in order to be able to afford child care? And this, by the way, would also be a useful buffer against any disruptions that did take place. I got a whole nother video on job guarantee. You can watch that one. All right, here's my last one. Here's my last common complaint about Sanders and why people like Chris Matthews are terrified. We can't afford Sanders' policies. Well, first off, how can we not afford to pursue climate change with the same sense of urgency and commitment that we had in fighting World War II? Second, afford isn't about money. It's about resources. Both the private and public sector can create money out of thin air, and the U.S. government cannot possibly go bankrupt in its own money. Now, there's way too much to say on that subject, so if you want to see more on that, perhaps go back and see my video number 6, How the American People Could Not Possibly Have Financed World War II, and it gives you a basic explanation. I got a bunch of posts on my Forbes blog that's entitled Pragmatic Economics. You search for that, you'll find it. If you want to know about the national debt and the idea that we can't possibly go bankrupt. Well, not the idea, the fact, because it's a legal fact. So, but going back to the basic point here, this for me is the issue that creates the huge gap between Sanders and the other Democratic hopefuls. The thing is that he, or more properly his advisors, the thing that they get right and the other Democrats, all of them, get wrong, is this issue right here. It's a make or break for me. It's like whether or not Clint Eastwood's in a movie. Sanders' policies put economic issues center stage, and they reject as economically ignorant promises to match any new spending with cuts elsewhere or new taxes. He may cut elsewhere and levy new taxes, but not because the government needs the money, because they don't. Now, why is this so important to me? Why is it so important to me that they have a reasonable, a logical economic policy backing up their ideas? And why is it that this, to me, separates him from everybody else? Well, think about this first. Generally speaking, there's a wide range of overlap among the Democratic candidates with respect to their values on social issues. They want dignity and agency for everybody. They may differ in detail, but for the most part, not in their essential values. Now, all that said, I would argue that universal economic security is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition to achieving these shared social goals. Let me say it again. We can argue for women's rights, racial equality, freedom to marry whomever you want, humane treatment for immigrants, etc., until we're blue in the face. But without a backdrop of economic security, we won't get there. What did the German people, folks whose values we generally consider to be pretty close to our own, what did they do in the 1930s? They traded political freedom for economic security. And when they were unable to understand why they were suffering, even though they felt like they were following all the rules, they were doing what you're supposed to do. Even though when they couldn't figure that out, they were willing to accept the scapegoats offered to them by the Nazis. And they did some victim blaming, and eventually they did far, far worse. It is extremely difficult to pursue progressive social policies within an environment of economic uncertainty and despair, when 69% of Americans have less than $1,000 in savings, when over 1 in 10 of us lives in poverty, over 15% of all children, when the wealthiest 1% of Americans own 40% of the wealth, while the bottom 90 own less than 25, folks are understandably more worried about themselves than social justice. And when they look for explanations as to why they're suffering, which quite often leads to irrational blame, especially when those people that are actually responsible for the ills are intentionally misdirecting your attention. We need a world where Americans trust one another. We need a world where people earn a living wage, where college students and others don't live like indentured servants, where we don't live in fear of the check engine light coming on, where the young generation doesn't have to assume it's going to be left to them to fix the climate, where those near the end of their lives do not have to face poverty on top of possible infirmity, and where they can keep their dignity. When we have that world, then and only then can we create the atmosphere of tolerance and goodwill that we all want. Sanders is the only candidate whose economic advisor is not part of the neoliberal camp that put us in this place to start with. We don't need to make that same mistake again. It's too late. We're running out of time. Thank you.